we'll wait about another minute or so. Just a couple of reminders that after tonight, there are 2 weeks left in this semester. We will meet on the 16th, but we're gonna meet later because I have a performance in Farmington, so we will start at 7. We're gonna go as far into the 19th century as we can in the next 2 weeks. And we're gonna finish up classical tonight. Just get the prelude or so of the 19th century and then move forward. As far as we get is as far as we get. I don't think we will make it all the way through the 19th century because it is a huge unit. It's just really a lot of stuff going on there. So we'll go as far as we can. And when we run out of time, we run out of time. They can just do more in 3 days on campus than we can in one night off campus. It's just how it is. So we'll go as far as we can, and that's as far as we'll get. Because I was trying to figure out how can we get to the 20th century. You know what? None of us need that stress. You don't need it, I don't need it. So we're just gonna do what we can do. That's what we're gonna do. If you go back and you're catching up on assignments, please let me know when you have finished those, so I know to go back and look for them. I don't go back and look for them because I don't know that you've done them. I move on. So if you're a few weeks, if you're a couple weeks behind or something, and you're catching up, let me know as you complete assignments, and I'll go back and get your grades and adjust things. But I won't probably go back and just look because I don't do that. So let me know if you are catching up and I need to go back and regrade some stuff for you. I'm happy to do it, but you need to let me know that I need to do it. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hey. So we were talking about Beethoven last week and the symphony, and today we're going to talk about Mozart and opera. Remember, Mozart would have been a very successful opera composer had he lived a little longer. He died at 35, and he was just really beginning to find his groove when it came to opera. He found out that he much more enjoyed writing for the common people and the city theater than he did for the court. Remember, Mozart really chafed under patronage. He didn't want to have to serve under patronage, but he was not successful at breaking that wall down. It was Beethoven who came along and was able to really make a success of being a composer without a set patron. So in the classical era, there are 2 types of Italian opera that were prevalent. The opera seria, which was serious opera, and opera buffa, which was comic opera. These operas were performed in Italian, no matter where you lived in the world. If you lived in Germany and you went to an opera seria, it was probably going to be in Italian. While serious opera continued to be a tradition of idealized characters and plots, heroes and great legends, that was the stuff that serious opera was written about. Comic opera tended to be more realistic and depictions of human concerns and emotions. Mozart wrote some of his great comic operas on plays that were popular at the time, especially Figaro. The Marriage of Figaro was one of Mozart's crowning achievements, and it was written on the play of the same name. The Marriage of Figaro manages to combine both serious and opera elements, comic opera elements, into one work that is still performed all over the world today. Somebody is getting ready to do Marriage of Figaro right now this minute. Okay. So when we're talking about classical opera from this time period being that use of the word classical, the prevalent form was opera seria, which is tragic Italian opera. Everybody dies. The guy does not get to keep, may get the girl, but he doesn't get to keep her. It was very highly formalized, and it came down from the Baroque pretty much intact. You still have recitative and aria, which were designed specifically to display the star singers and their talent to the aristocracy. Opera seria was performed for the high mucky mucks, the kings and the queens, and the dukes and the princes. This was not the opera of the common people. It was performed in Italian. So, you know, if you're in Germany and you don't speak Italian, why would you want to see an opera seria anyway? Are you going to know what's going on? Probably not. The rigid conventions of opera seria were largely shaped by Pietro Metasio, who wrote many librettos. Remember, libretto is the storyline of an opera that featured stories of royalty and heroes drawn from classic antiquity. Remember, we had a fascination with the Greek and Roman world. So often the characters in these operas were taken from Greek and Roman legend or stories about the Greek and Roman gods. Increasingly, however, artists and audiences were moving toward a more simple style of opera that more accurately reflected what human life was really like. And that was comic opera, opera buffa, which was Italian comic opera, or opera comique, which is the French version. French opera has some spoken dialogue, where opera buffa is sung throughout. Everything is sung. The recitatives are the dialogue that move the story along, and the arias are the beautiful song that grinds everything to a halt, so the star can sing about how happy they are, or how sad they are, or how in love they are, or how devastated they are because they're no longer in love. In English, we call it a ballad opera or a dialogue opera. These usually, like the opera comique, have some spoken dialogue. In the next time period, we're going to have a pair of composers, Gilbert and Sullivan in England, who are going to write ballad operas that are exquisite little gems and so much fun and always funny. And they include spoken dialogue in they're called operettas at that point. And Gilbert and Sullivan wrote HMS Pinafore, they wrote The Pirates of Penzance. They great stuff. So this comic opera style that's more accessible for common people is going to spread throughout Europe, and every country is going to kind of have their own little spin on it. Oh, I forgot to mention Singspiel, which is the German equivalent of these other things. They also have some spoken dialogue. So remember, we have a rising middle class now that can afford to go to the opera house and hear a comic opera, you know, like we go to the movies. They would go, and that was entertainment. And they would make a day of it. They'd bring a picnic basket. They didn't really sell popcorn at, you know, at that time. So they bring a picnic basket, and they'd eat and they'd drink and they'd watch the operas and they'd laugh, and sometimes they would sing along, because sometimes these songs were based on popular songs of the day, so they would know the tune. Unlike serious opera, which was always in Italian, comic opera was generally in vernacular. So if you're in Germany and you go to see a Singspiel, it's going to be sung in German. If you go to the Opera Comique in France, it's going to be sung in French. So again, that makes it accessible for common people. The aristocracy can speak many languages, but common people tend to speak one, and they could speak their own language. So these comic operas were set in their own language so that they can be enjoyed by everybody. Opera buffa was always lively and presented down to earth plots. You know, guy meets girl, guy and girl fight. In the end, guy and girl get together and everybody's happy. Usually these have a happier ending than a tragic Italian opera where there is no happy ending, everybody dies. A little bit like a Shakespearean tragedy as opposed to a Shakespearean comedy. In Shakespearean tragedy, everybody dies, and in Shakespearean comedy, everybody gets the girl and everybody's happy. So they often featured exciting ensembles at the end of each act, in which all the characters participated instead of a succession of solo arias heard in the older style. So at the end of Act 1, everybody would be on stage. They might be singing different things at the same time, but it all came together into one big kind of chorus number. And that's kind of true in musical theater these days too. That happens a lot at the end of Act 1, that it's a big number at the end and everybody's on stage and everybody sings, and then you have an intermission and you go eat, drink some things and go to the bathroom. So as the age of revolution approached, remember there are going to be a lot of revolutions in this time in France and elsewhere, comic opera became an important social force whose lively wit delighted even the aristocrats it satirized. Opera buffa spread very quickly and expanded its scope until it culminated in the works of Mozart. Mozart is the height, he is the pinnacle of this opera buffa comic opera trend. He wrote 3 comic operas that are beloved still all over the world: Così fan tutti, or Women Are Like That, Don Giovanni, and Marriage of Figaro, Le Nozze di Figaro. Okay, Don Giovanni, interestingly enough, is called a comic opera, but in the end, everybody dies. But Don Giovanni learns his lesson. This is translated to Don Juan. You may have heard of a Don Juan, who is a womanizer and can seduce any woman. And in the end, Don Juan has made a pact with the devil, and so that he can be this, playboy and get any woman he wants. And the devil comes and takes his soul at the end. So that doesn't sound so happy, but it's considered a comic opera because it's not based on a Greek or Roman legend. It's based on a book. Figaro was the first effort between Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte, who is one of his favorite librettists. They worked together several times. The play it was based on was by a French author, and it had been banned in Vienna because of its depiction of common people being oppressed by the nobility. Which, of course, that would appeal to Mozart off the bat, right? Because he didn't much care for the nobility anyway. So, of course, he would gravitate toward this kind of play and want a libretto based on something like that. Mozart and da Ponte changed the story's emphasis from political intrigue to love hijinks, making social critique the subplot instead of the main point. In this way, Mozart was able to present this opera and get away with it without getting in trouble. In the story, Figaro is a servant and a right-hand man to the powerful Count Almaviva, and his beloved Susanna is servant to the Countess, and they're about to get married. So Figaro and Susanna want to get married. They're both servants, but Susanna is being harassed by the Count, who is a notorious womanizer. And the premise was kept that the Count wishes to claim his right of first night, prima nocta, with Susanna. It's a semi-fictional right of a nobleman to sleep with the spouse of a servant on her wedding night. That was a real thing. But he made the libretto makes the Count somewhat more sympathetic by having him want Susanna to fall in love with him first. But Susanna is in love with Figaro. Now, of course, this makes Figaro angry. And he is directed at the wrongful power. His anger is directed at the Count because he has this power that he can, sleep with Susanna before Figaro gets to, which is not okay. And in the opera, he's more jealous of Susanna, afraid that she might really fall for the Count. Spoiler alert, she's not going to. The opera could then be played for knowing laughter and socially safe references to women's betrayal of men. The Countess is in turn jealous of the Count because he's chasing Susanna. And adding to the two couples' difficulties, and everything's going to work out in the end, is the character of Cherubino, who is a teenage boy who falls in love with every woman he sees, and with whom both Susanna and the Countess are clearly enchanted. Cherubino's a good-looking kid, and so he falls in love with every woman, and they kind of fall in love a little bit with him too. While the play's Cherubino is a younger version of the Count and represents the sins of nobility, in Figaro he's an entirely appealing character, often at the center of the most complicated comic situations. So when we first meet Cherubino, he's in Susanna's room singing an aria to the Countess about his lovesick state. He says, "I don't know what I am, what I'm doing, At first they seem to be burning and then freezing. Every woman makes me change color. Mozart wrote the role, sometimes called a trouser or a pants role, for a mezzo soprano. So Cherubino is actually played by a woman who dresses as a man. This was very common, especially in Mozart operas. He often writes pants roles. He wants to be able to convey the youth of Cherubino, and so he's so young that his voice hasn't changed, and so it's easier for a mezzo soprano for a woman to sing that part than it would be a man. The aria is followed by recitative, and the rapid fire talky kind of singing accompanied by simple harmonies. And the main function of recitative, remember, is to move the plot forward. That's where the dialogue takes place. Now the action moves very quickly. The Count arrives to arrange a tryst with Susanna, and Cherubino hides behind a large armchair. The music master, Basilio, who delights in uncovering other people's secrets, comes looking for the Count. And the Count also tries to hide behind the chair where Cherubino is, but Cherubino slips onto the chair and Susanna covers him with a blanket. Basilio, who knows the Count is hiding, provokes him to step forward by suggesting that Cherubino is chasing the Countess. And then they have a trio where they all three sing. Susanna is anxious to get both men out of the room. The Count is angry, but he's still trying to chase Susanna. And Basilio is having a wonderful time because of all this intrigue. He's a gossip, and he likes to uncover other people's secrets and know everything about everybody. He's nosy. At one point, the Count throws off the throw and finds Cherubino, and then they sing some more. Mozart's ability to match the demands of a dramatic situation with musical forms is evident in this trio. It's wonderful musical writing, but it also serves the plot because all three of these characters have something to say. And instead of giving them all a separate aria, he puts them all together into one trio, which is a good move. It moves the plot along faster. You don't have to sit through so many arias, but you still understand what's happening. In Figaro and other comic operas, Mozart holds up a mirror to society and points out that the contradictions inherent in separating people based on class and gender should be coming to an end. Remember, Mozart is not a big fan of the nobility, and so he likes to make these points in a way that won't get him in trouble because it's lighthearted and it's funny. This is another reason why his operas still speak so strongly to modern audiences. They still can be understood to contain messages about social unfairness and the rights of individuals, ideas that appealed to audiences then and now. So let's hear some of The Marriage of Figaro. This is Act 1, and this is going to be bits and pieces. So this is an aria by Cherubino, which is going to be followed by the recitative of Susanna, the Count, and Basilio. And then we have the trio where all three of those characters sing. So you notice we have that capo aria, A, B, A. Now here's a C section, which is different. In other words, I think about being in love all the time when I'm awake, when I'm asleep. And I talk about it to the flowers and the shadows and the mountains, whoever will listen. I'm speaking. So you can hear them talking back and forth to each other. So just feel outside the room.
E compare in modestia e si conto s'accorge e si non sapete perché compro io vengo e tutti dicono io non ci aggiungo
Here we are, starting the trio. Now they're all singing what they just said, but at the same time.
Il muso insospettivo, ma non c'è un visito.
So it says Carabino was at her cousin's house. Hiding under the table. Before. So you can see it's played for laughs, it's funny, but it moves along. And those are the three separate components, we've already heard all that together. If you'd like to see the videos of this, rather than just hearing it, it is available in your ebook. So we're in the chapter, where are we, 37? And there are videos here where you could see that scene, and it might make a little more sense to you when you see it played out. Notice that this is an opera where they're in modern dress. So this is Carabino, and this is Susanna, okay? So you might want to check that out. If you're still a little bit confused about what the characters are doing, this will probably give you what you need to figure that out. Okay. Mozart and his unfinished Requiem. A Requiem Mass is a mass for the dead, a funeral mass. Some other sacred music genres of the later 1700s were the oratorio, which we've talked about before, the Mass, and then, of course, the Requiem Mass. Mozart left his Requiem Mass unfinished. He died before he was able to finish it. The Mass is the musical setting of the Catholic worship service, and a Requiem Mass is specifically for a funeral. An oratorio is a large-scale dramatic work originating in the Baroque, like Handel's Messiah, which is based on a text of religious or serious character. It's not staged, it does not have scenery, costumes, or action, but all the other elements of opera were there. Remember, Handel was a lover of opera, wanted to be a successful opera composer, but ended up finding his groove in England by writing oratorio. Mozart's Requiem was his last large-scale composition, and it's one of the masterpieces of the classical era. Eventually, it was finished by one of his favorite pupils, Franz Xaver Süssmayr. But we can attribute to Mozart himself the dramatic Dies Irae. By the way, if you're watching the recording tonight, Dies Irae is your code word. Dies Irae, right here, Day of Wrath. The Dies Irae is a vision of Judgment Day. The sheep are going to be separated from the goats. The good guys are going to get to go to heaven, and the bad guys are going to get to go to hell. And so this is a day of terrible wrath, a day of wrath, day that will dissolve the world into burning coals, such as David bore witness with the Sibyl, is how it begins. The score calls for 4 soloists, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and a 4-part chorus, accompanied by an orchestra that includes basset horns, almost said basset hounds, those are dogs, basset horns, which is an alto range clarinet, and bassoons. Bassoons play very low. They're kind of like the tubas at this time, because tubas didn't really exist yet. The extended use of low winds and brass timbres is a relative novelty, and it makes for a really stunning presentation because it sounds low and rumbly and kind of ominous, because we're talking about, the end of the world. So sounding ominous is okay at this point. The power of Mozart's Dies Irae unfurls against the headlong running notes and shattering accents. Quantus tremor est futurus, how great a tremor there will be. And the wavering lines paint the text vividly. Remember text painting? You wanted the music to sound like the words say it should sound. In this particular instance, Mozart does a masterful job of presenting the end of the world and how scary that would all be. An abrupt cadence leads to tuba mirum, a trumpet with astonishing sound. That's the trumpet blowing at the end of the world, featuring a memorable trombone solo and a bass singer who together summon souls before the throne of God to be judged. The other soloists enter one by one. The tenor, who sings a lower andante on Mors stupibit et natura, death will be stunned, as will nature, followed by the alto and soprano, ending in a final solo quartet. The final chorus, Rex Tremendae Majestis, King of tremendous majesty, that's Jesus, in the end he wins, fiercely projects the sense of the words. Salva me bons pietis, which is save me, fount of piety. I'm a believer, help me be saved. And that part is sung softly. You don't want to be too bossy before the throne of God. That would be a bad idea. A relative recounted that on December 4th, 1791, as the composer lay feverishly weak on his bed, several professional singers sang through the completed portions of the Requiem with Mozart on the alto line. So he was well enough to sing it, but he was in the process of dying. At the Lacrimosa, which means weeping, verse, he put the music aside and wept, and then he died the same night. It's likely that stories like this were embellished by those who wanted to highlight the almost supernatural expressive palette of the work and to raise Mozart's reputation to an even more remarkable level after his death. Remember, he was not wealthy at the time of his death. He had spent all the money he had made, but his widow, Constanza, was a pretty savvy lady, and she was wise enough to gather up his unfinished writings and to resell those to take care of herself and her children. So to embellish a story like this and make it seem even more remarkable that he was able to sing this part and then he wept when they sang the Lacrimosa, and then that same night he was dead, that's good press. And that kind of story is going to get passed around and people are going to remember that. And when they have the opportunity to buy a copy of the Requiem, they're going to buy it because that appeals to humans. That kind of spooky stuff, we still like that kind of spooky stuff. How many of us go to spooky, scary movies and watch them on TV? Lots of us. So that kind of thing has really not changed. It is a remarkable piece of work. It is one of my actual favorite long forms that Mozart wrote. Love the Requiem. This moving work was chosen for the funeral of President John F. Kennedy when he was assassinated in 1963. And in 2002, on the 1-year anniversary of the September 11 attack on the World Trade Center, a performance of Mozart's Requiem was given in all 4 corners of the globe in Europe, Asia, Central America, and the United States, each beginning at 8:46 a.m., which was the time that the plane hit the first tower. Mozart could never have imagined what this work would mean to the world, but he would have been ecstatic. He would have been very happy to know that this piece of work still resonates so deeply with us today. So let's hear the Dies Irae. So this is the opening statement. Dies Irae, Dies Ira. Day of wrath, day that will dissolve the world into burning coals, as David bore witness with the Sibyl. Remember, Dies Irae is your code word for this week. Sounds excited and happy at the same time, which makes Here comes the tenor. Tenor's telling the story of Judgment Day. They said they're gonna open the graves and they're gonna bring all souls before the throne of God, and then the book's gonna be brought out where your life is recorded. And then you'll be judged from what's in the book. Here's the alto. Here's the soprano. This is the quartet. They're singing the same words that the soprano just sang. Beautiful. Human beings are capable of some amazing things sometimes. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the classical period. Okay, we're not going to do this. You can do that on your own if you'd like, but we're not going to do it because we're going to dash on. So you should complete, we're not done, we're gonna go ahead and start the next unit, but to wrap this up, you should complete, oh, I'm sorry, this is the ebook, no wonder I can't find what I want. In the inquisitive, you should complete the classical era quiz and listening quiz. Right here, you do not have to do chapter 37, you do not have to do chapter 38, just do the quiz, okay? If these help you to prepare for that, that's fine, you can do them, but I'm not going to grade them, I'm going to grade this. So, this is what you need to complete to wrap up classicism, okay? But we're gonna go on and talk about and get started on the 19th century. So, we have Mozart as that bridge character who takes us from the end of the classical period and into what we think of as the Romantic period, romantic with a capital R. Music can express everything. For describing scenes of nature, it has ideal colors and lines, neither exact nor yet too minute, but which are all the more vaguely and delightfully poetical. And that was written by the Baroness Dudevant, who went by the pen name George Sand. Even though she was a baroness and well known and wealthy, she couldn't get anything published under her own name. So she went by the pen name George Sand. She had quite the affair with the composer Chopin. They were quite the thing. So here is a timeline. Here's what's happening in the United States at the beginning of this period. We just bought the Louisiana Purchase. Pride and Prejudice is published. And then Franz Schubert writes The Earl King, which we've heard before. Then Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo and sent packing to the Isle of Elba. Frederick Chopin, who I just mentioned as being involved in an affair with the poet George Sand, completes his Opus 40 Polonaises, and Adolphe Sax develops the saxophone. God bless him. Fanny Hensel begins composing The Year while in Italy. She is the sister of Mendelssohn, who is another composer of this era. Texas is annexed in the United States. We have Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto, which is an opera, performed for the first time in Venice. Stephen Foster publishes Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species, and the American Civil War begins. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables was published, and the first performance of Richard Wagner's Die Valkyrie is performed in Munich. Edvard Grieg writes incidental music for the play Peer Gynt. Thomas Edison invents the cylinder phonograph that engraved what you wanted to preserve onto wax cylinders. Johannes Brahms, Symphony No. 3 is premiered in Vienna, and Scott Joplin writes and publishes Maple Leaf Rag. So you can see that's pretty broad, and it's getting pretty close to what we think of as a modern era. Napoleon Bonaparte said, music of all the liberal arts has the greatest influence over the passions. And I would tend to agree with that, although the written word can be pretty important too. Romanticism is one of the leading artistic trends for which beginnings can almost readily be identified. And it was a self-conscious break from the ideals of the Enlightenment. Remember, Enlightenment and the classical period was all about symmetry and form and everything being perfectly balanced. Well, the Romantics wanted none of that. They wanted things messy, sloppy, colorful, macabre, scary, beautiful, just a great big mess. You've heard the term bohemian before. That comes directly from this period of time. To be wild and bohemian and living over somebody's garage because you couldn't afford it any place else, and wondering where your next meal was going to come from, but creating wonderful, beautiful art, whatever kind of art that was for you, was very much the Romantic ideal. Ludwig van Beethoven, who is often identified as the first great creative Romantic, and whose influence looms to the present day as an embodiment of passionate individual expression, was the hero of the Romantic composers. They also revered Mozart for the exact opposite reason. Beethoven was successful at becoming his own man. Mozart was not successful, so they regarded Mozart as a beautiful tragedy and Beethoven as a great success story. Many of the common tenets of Romanticism are still very much with us today. The artist struggling rather than working within society and convention, the need for art to unsettle rather than soothe, the belief that works display the creator's distinctive originality and self-expression. That all sounds pretty common to us today. But at the time, it was considered shocking because we were just coming out of the Enlightenment, where everything was neat and tidy and tied up in a symmetrical bow. Romantics don't want anything to do with that. This was an age of revolutions. We had the French Revolution in the 1700s, and their cry was liberty, equality, and fraternity. That was the slogan of the French Revolution. They wanted everybody to be free, everybody to be equal, and everyone to act like brothers. This inspired many visions of hope that could actually come true. You know, in some ways, we're still striving for that today. They felt sympathy for the oppressed. They had an interest in peasants, workers, and children. They had faith in humankind and its destiny, all formed increasingly democratic characteristic of the Romantic period, and inspired a series of revolutions and rebellions that gradually led to the modern political landscape of Europe. So we had kicked out the king in France in the 1700s. Now it's going to happen elsewhere, and things are going to become more democratic rather than aristocratic. Romantic poets and artists rebelled against conventional concerns of their classical predecessors. They were drawn to the fanciful, the picturesque, the passionate. They liked really scary stuff, really dark stuff. They liked they loved being in love. They fell in love 17 times before breakfast, and when their love affair didn't work out, they were wildly passionate about that and went into depths of despair. I'm different from all the men I have seen, said Rousseau. If I am not better, at least I am different. So I am me. This is me, like in The Greatest Showman. This is who I am. You're going to have to take me for what I am. And maybe I'm not better than you, but I have my own soul and I'm the captain of my own ship. You do your thing and I'll do mine. In Germany, a group of young writers created a new kind of lyric poetry that culminated in the work of Heinrich Heine. And he was a favorite poet of the Romantic composers. A similar movement was led in France by Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables. And he was a writer of prose. Les Mis is a novel. In England, the revolt against the formalism of the classical age produced an outpouring of emotional lyric poetry that reached its peak in the works of Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. You've probably heard all three of those names at some point. If you haven't, I hope you will soon. Confronted by a world indifferent to artistic and cultural values, artists felt more and more cut off from society. So they kind of created their own society, a bohemian society, a rejected dreamer who starved in an attic and shocked the establishment through peculiar dress and behavior. That kind of sounds familiar too, doesn't it? Yeah. Artists today, make a lot of hay out of being different and doing their own thing. The first person that springs to mind right now is Billy Porter. Somebody else that springs to mind is Harry Styles. They are just as well known for what they wear and how outrageous they can be as they are for their talent. And that's very much a romantic bohemian kind of ideal. Eternal longing, regret for the lost happiness of childhood, and indefinite, indefinable discontent that gnaws away at the soul These are ingredients of the romantic mood. The romantic mood was not one of requited love. In fact, they liked it maybe better if their love was not returned, because it gave them more to paint, write, and sing about. The artist's pessimism was based in reality. They looked around and said, you know, things really aren't all that great. If you're not wealthy, your life still really isn't all that terrific. And it became apparent that the high hopes that were fostered by the French Revolution were not just automatically going to happen. You know, just because you overthrow the king doesn't mean that everything's going to be sunshine and puppy dogs the next day. There are a lot of things to work out. If you have seen Hamilton, they talk about that in Hamilton, that, you know, okay, you've freed yourself from England. Now what are you going to do? And then they had to sort of invent democracy because it really hadn't been a thing. So they had to kind of work it out as they went along, and it was really messy and really difficult. You can say all the brave slogans you want, but all people were not yet equal or free. Unfortunately, that is still true. So the optimism that they felt after the French Revolution began to give way to doubt and disenchantment, that state of mind was reflected in the arts and in literature. Society is mirrored by the arts. The arts tell us what's really going on. And usually these days, in not an idealized way. They hold up a mirror to society and to what's going on in political climates and in social climates. And the arts reflect that and kind of record it. Remember way back when we talked about the troubadours and trouvères, they were going from town to town and singing about political intrigue, making fun of the king, kind of telling it like it really was. That's what the Romantics are doing too. They're doing it in a somewhat grander style, but they're still saying, you know, not everybody's free. There are still people who are oppressed and who don't have enough to eat. There's still people who want to be able to be themselves but can't be. So we're not a great society yet. The 19th century novel found one of its great themes in the conflict between the individual and society. Hugo dedicated Les Miserables to the unhappy ones of the earth. Hopefully you know the story of Les Miserables. Jean Valjean was imprisoned for many years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's child, to keep his nephew from starving. And so he was thrown into prison when he was released. He couldn't find work because he was a former convict. And so he tears up his parole papers and invents a brand new persona for himself. But one of his jailers can't let go of who he used to be, the fact that he used to be a prisoner, and pursues him and tries to ruin his life forever. Yeah. So Jean Valjean is among the era's memorable discontented. You may have seen the film with Hugh Jackman or the stage play. Some writers sought to escape by glamorizing the past, like Walter Scott did in Ivanhoe, and Alexandre Dumas in The Three Musketeers. The Man of the Iron Mask is also a Dumas piece. I want to say Hunchback of Notre Dame is too, but I'm not sure that's accurate. I would have to look that up to be sure I'm right about that. They long for exotic, far-off lands. And so you see that reflected in art, but you also see it reflected in music. They loved strangeness and wonder. So we see poems like Kubla Khan, and we see the isolation and desperation in The Scarlet Letter, which many of you may have read for school, and the supernatural atmosphere we encounter in Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. My favorite Poe is actually Annabel Lee, but that's just me trivia. So the Industrial Revolution brings with it the means to create more affordable and responsive musical instruments. And we're constantly improving the quality of instruments so they're able to do more, which gives composers more to work with. They were more affordable because they could be mass produced. We're getting closer to Henry Ford's assembly line. We're not quite there yet, but we're on the cusp. Things like the cotton gin were invented and made life better through automation, made your job easier through automation. The technical improvements that strongly influenced the sound of romantic music came from these more affordable and responsive musical instruments. Here's a scene from 1993's performance of Les Mis. These are the barricades. Some people get this confused. They think this is about the original French Revolution, but it's not. It's about later, more contemporary to this time period. As music moved from palace and church to public concert hall, orchestras increased in size. And that, of course, influenced the sound. You had more instruments, so of course the sound can get much bigger. New instruments such as the piccolo, the English horn, the tuba, and the contrabassoon gave us new timbres and extended the high and low ranges of the orchestra. We could also have very loud fortissimo, fortissimo, and very soft pianissimo, because our instruments were capable of doing that now. So you could go from really thunderously loud to whispery soft, and that really appealed to the Romantics, because remember, they were all about emotion and portraying that emotion. So they would want the extremes of very, very loud and very, very soft. As orchestral music developed, so did the technique of writing for instruments. Orchestration became an art in itself. To orchestrate something is to decide which instruments will play which parts. The flutes are going to have this line because it needs to be light and delicate or playful. The tuba is going to have this line because it needs to sound heavy and ponderous, and it needs to almost feel like it's an effort to make it move along. And that's the art of orchestration, is deciding what instrument's going to play what parts. Composers had a very broad palette now. They had a lot of dynamic contrast, and they had new instruments to use to orchestrate with, so that they could make the orchestra sound the way they wanted it to sound, the way that they heard it in their heads, and the way that they wanted their emotion to be conveyed. In order to communicate their intentions as precisely as possible, composers developed a vocabulary of highly expressive musical terms. These are common today, but at the time these were new, like dolce, which means sweet, cantabile, which means like a song, dolento, sorrowful, maestoso, majestic, giocoso, joyous, and con amore, with love or in a very tender way. A new interest in folklore and nationalism, which is glorification of one's home country, inspired composers to make increased use of folk songs and folk dances from their native lands. Chopin is known for doing this with his polonaises. As a result, a number of national styles, Hungarian, Polish, Russian, Bohemian, Scandinavian, and eventually American, flourished and enriched the language of music. We also were attracted, remember, to the exotic, and we wanted to write about things far, far away, like Asia and the Far East. Now, you may not have ever been there, so you only had a vague impression of what that must be like, but you could read about it in books, and you could talk to people who had been there. And so opera composers often drew on exotic themes now, rather than always sticking with Greek and Roman myths. Giuseppe Verdi is going to write Aida, which is set in Egypt, and Puccini is going to write Madame Butterfly, which is set in Japan. Puccini, I don't think ever actually visited Japan, but he set an opera there. Above all, 19th century musicians tried to make their instruments sing. They wanted them to be cantabile, in a singing style. Melody was marked by lyricism, so that it was a very tuneful sound. We're not to the point yet where things are going to be disjointed and kind of dissonant and clashing on purpose. We use dissonance in small doses to portray emotion or to portray a mood. We didn't make things that were dissonant just for dissonance sake. That's going to happen in the later 19th century and the 20th century when there are no more rules. All the rules are gone. It's no accident that themes from romantic symphonies and concertos have been transformed into popular songs, and that tunes by composers like Chopin, Verdi, and Tchaikovsky have endured with the public and are still very familiar today. Tchaikovsky, of course, wrote the Nutcracker Suite that is performed at Christmas time all over the world and every other year in Farmington. The Romantic Orchestra is much larger in size. Berlioz, this is Berlioz Orchestra from 1830. So you can see he expands his percussion section and adds a bunch of stuff that we hadn't had before. He also adds cornets, 2 trumpets, which we had had before, and ophicleides, which is no longer a thing. Those are going to turn into baritones and euphoniums. You can compare that to Brahms's orchestra. Brahms didn't do harp, didn't care for it. And went back to the percussion section, it was really just timpani. And then in the Nutcracker Suite, we got all this stuff going on. And see, you can follow the progression of years. Composers used pitches that were more chromatic and dissonant, but remember, it's going to be for specific reasons. They expanded the instrumental forms that had come down from the classical masters. Symphonies. A symphony by Haydn or Mozart takes about 20 minutes to perform, but Brahms lasts at least twice that long. Where Haydn wrote more than 100 symphonies and Mozart wrote 40, Franz Schubert wrote 9, just like Beethoven, and Brahms only wrote 4. New orchestral forms emerged as well, including the one-movement symphonic poem, the choral symphony. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about Beethoven's Ninth and Ode to Joy, and works for solo voice with orchestra. In many of these works, we can see how music in the 19th century drew steadily closer to the other arts. Romantic composers captured with remarkable vividness the emotional atmosphere that surrounded poetry and painting. So the arts are becoming more integrated and more a whole. It's not just music that makes a movement, it's all arts that move in tandem, they move together. If they're painting it or they're writing about it, then they're also singing about it or they're writing symphonies about it. These things move as a big wave. 19th century music was linked to dreams and passions, to profound meditations on life and death, human destiny, God and nature, pride in one's country, desire for freedom, the political struggles of the age, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. These intellectual and emotional associations brought music into a commanding position as a link between the artist's most personal thoughts and the realities of the outside world. Musical life now reached the general populace. Since performances took place in the public concert hall as well as in the salons of the aristocracy. The public concert hall is the center of a city now. 18th century musicians had been glorified servants. But now 19th century musicians, supported by a new middle class, met their audience as equals. So no more patronage. That's a thing of the past. Beethoven smashed that into little bitty bits. They could make a living in their profession. Solo performers began to dominate the concert hall. Violinists like Paganini, pianists like Chopin, conductors like Franz Liszt, who was both a pianist and a conductor. They became great stars. They were the rock stars of their day. Their names were known everywhere. Women fainted, and men would be just like them, which is hard to do if you don't play an instrument. Although composition remained largely a man's province, a few women began to make some inroads. One was Clara Schumann, who was married to Robert Schumann, who was also a very important composer. Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, who is the sister of Mendelssohn, who is a composer of this era. And we already talked about George Sand being the Baroness, who was Chopin's support system financially, and also was involved with him romantically. And Princess Caroline said Wittgenstein was Liszt's financial and emotional support. Nahidsta von Meck is remembered as the mysterious woman who supported Tchaikovsky in the early years of his career and made it financially possible for him to compose. There was a lucrative musical market for both home and concert hall. So music began to be published for use at home. Stephen Foster was an American composer who was really exploited by the publishing industry. He was not a great businessman, and so he didn't make nearly as much money as he should have for the popularity of his music and how widespread its use was. But others were much better businessmen, like Giuseppe Verdi. He was a savvy businessman and helped to establish economic models to benefit musicians and that continue to be used to this day. So he made money, and he made sure that other people could make money too. There were distinctions between light music for entertainment and art music for serious listening. So like popular music, as opposed to more serious listening music, art music. Popular and classical. Remember, we talked about classical being kind of a catch-all term, even though it is a very specific time period in what we're studying. So light music or popular music began to be thought of as more common, not as fancy and not as sophisticated. So it would be more lowbrow, where art music or quote unquote classical music was more highbrow and more intellectual. Okay, I think we will stop right there. So, along with the 18th century classicism era quiz, listening quiz, you should also complete Prelude 5. And then we'll pick it up next time with chapter 39, and we'll go as far as we can go in the next 2 weeks. Okay, so if there are questions, please let me know. If you go back and you're catching up on things, let me know as you catch up on those things so that I can go back and adjust your grades, because like I said, I don't go back and look just to go back and look. So you need to let me know when you complete those things so I can go back and fix it. Okay. If there are no questions, then I will see you next week and we'll pick it up with chapter 39. So please complete the quiz and Prelude 5.